Hi.
Hello, good evening to you. I'm Councillor Russell Gordon-Smith, the chair of the advisory group, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the meeting. This meeting is being held virtually and in accordance with the Council's rules for virtual meetings. Councillors are reminded that although this meeting is held remotely, they're regarded as being present in a meeting of the Council, and they should observe the normal rules of behaviour. First of all, can I ask everyone present in this virtual meeting, that your microphones remain muted and your camera is turned off when you're not addressing the meeting. This will reduce the background noise and avoid any unintentional disturbances. And can members also ensure that their mobile phones are now switched off or are on silence? Can I also advise that the meeting is being audio recorded and live streamed from the Council's website. In addition, a video recording of the meeting will be uploaded to the Council's YouTube channel after the meeting. Members and officers, where appropriate for each item, please use the chat function of the meeting to indicate that you wish to speak or to raise a point of order or explanation, and I will invite you to speak at the appropriate time. Each member will be invited to speak in turn. Therefore, I would encourage all members to keep your contribution as clear and concise as possible. When you're speaking and referring to the agenda papers, can you make sure that you reference the pages or paragraph number? If members wish to leave the meeting at any point, could they please make themselves known to me through the chat function? I will then announce to the meeting that you are leaving. I understand that we have no members of the public or visiting councillors who have registered to speak to us this evening, so I'll proceed with the meeting and ask the Democratic Services Officer to undertake a roll call of members of the committee to confirm who is present this evening. Can I please ask Nancy to list which officers are present this evening?
Thank you, Chair. Should I just go through the members of the committee, members of the panel first?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, we've got Councillor Brooke. If I can just ask you to just confirm that you're present.
Yes,
please.
I'm present.
Thank you. Councillor Clear.
Yes, present.
Thank you. Councillor Edwards. Okay, I'll come back to Councillor Edwards. Councillor Evans. And I'll come back to Councillor Evans. Councillor Horrell.
Good evening. Yes, I'm present.
Thank you. And Councillor Thompson.
Hello. Yes, I'm present. Thank you.
Thank you. And looking at the online, we also have Councillors Weston, Pearson and Power joining us. But as far as I can tell, Chair, we haven't got Councillors Edwards or Evans at the moment.
Right. Well, I think we better crack on with it.
Oh, officers, sorry, you wanted me to go through the list of officers,
yes,
sorry.
Yes.
We've got Adrian Fox and Simon Finch and Katie Morgans and various other people, Steve Opachik, Jill Lee and Bethany Stokes. Oh, and Dawn. I'm so sorry, Dawn. Yeah, behind me. Yeah.
Sitting quietly in the background. Right, okay, well, let's begin then. We've had apologies, so disclosures of interest.
None, Chair, thank you.
It was Caroline Horrell. Oh, right, okay, good.
There's nothing indicated on the chat either, Chair.
Right, I hope you've all managed to read the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 27th of September. They're included on page 5 to 10 of the agenda pack. Are you happy if we accept those as signed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Jolly
Agreed.
good, thank you. Right, now then, no public wishing to participate at the moment. So what we might do is go on to the next item, which is the landscape character assessment. And Katie Morgans will introduce and share a presentation, and we can follow that with questions and debate.
Hi.
Good
Something's
evening.
happened to my hair. It's gone all purple. I don't know what's going on. Sorry about that. I haven't really got a presentation. I've got the whole document, which you're very welcome. I can share a screen on. I was just going to give a little explanation, really, of why I'm on your agenda.
Right, okay, well, let's have that.
Okay.
And would it be useful, it is a very long document.
Yes.
There was quite a good summary at the end of about 3 or 4 pages. Would that be useful to run
It could
through
be.
that?
I mean, it may be that my little bit now is sufficient. So
Okay, let's do that then.
Yeah. So I'm going to read something. So apologies, my head's going to be at a funny angle.
Okay.
So Winchester's current landscape character assessment was published in 2004 and is now being updated. The update, it's pretty much been updated actually. The update captures changes seen in the district over the past 16 years, including the creation of the South Downs National Park. As the South Downs have published their own landscape character assessment, Winchester has decided to remove areas of the district that fall within the national park. This will mean that some parishes lie in both Winchester's district and South Downs, and will have 2 landscape character assessments to refer to, just as they do with local plans. And there'll be some parishes, obviously, that don't fall under our character assessment at all, because they're fully within the South Downs. So a landscape character assessment is the identification and description of variations in the character of the landscape. It is the unique combination of elements and features that make landscape distinct. It describes how the landscape is perceived, experienced and valued by people. So landscape character assessments are used by forming part of the local plan as a often as a supplementary planning document, providing evidence to inform strategic land use planning, green infrastructure strategies and neighbourhood planning, and by providing evidence against which to assess proposed development. They assess areas under 2 categories: landscape character areas and landscape character types. The former is a single, unique, discrete geographical area consisting of 1 or more landscape types. The latter is generic in nature and may occur in different areas, but will share similar combinations of geology, topography, drainage patterns, vegetation, historical land use and settlement pattern. So the notable changes to the 2004 version are boundary changes due to the removal of the South Downs, increased development and suburbanisation, settlement expansion and scattered development in rural areas. The introduction of new land uses such as solar farms, vineyards, intrusive vertical elements, so masts for mobiles and that sort of thing, are also taken into account. I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to say there. So, and also areas which have been subjected to, might have been wooded, but have been subjected to quite a lot of tree disease, such as ash dieback, which is quite prolific now throughout the district and the county. So the 2004 landscape character assessment had been adopted as a supplementary planning document, and we're going to go to Cabinet in December to request that this update, so the 2021 version, is also adopted as a supplementary planning document, and ask to undertake a 6-week consultation period in the new year. We have already done some consultation with officers internally and all the parishes and town forums via a Teams event on the 11th of August. And I also introduced the landscape character assessment to 3 members back in September to explain, why we were going to take this to Cabinet. So the update is we'll be awaiting obviously comments following the consultation, assuming we get the go ahead for that. And then it'll be published online, and there'll be some printed copies as well. It'll be a much improved online version because the current one is in lots of volumes and you have to jump around and you never quite know if you're in the right section. And although it'll still be a PDF format, it's that sort of jumpable or hyperlinkable, I don't know if they're words, but anyway, so that you can snap to something immediately and then back again. And it will have supporting mapping in GIS as well. And then in time, we hope to be able to sort of link the two a little bit more cohesively, but they'll sort of run separately initially. So that's an introduction to it. And I'll just, if I share my screen, you can just see what the document looks like. Hopefully that's popped up. And it's 322 pages really, so it's quite big, but you'll be able to jump, between. So for example, if you wanted to find out what an open arable landscape type is, you should be able to click on that and it'll jump to it. Something's not working. Maybe it doesn't work when you're sharing the screen. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. I think we obviously wanted to introduce the landscape character assessment to this group because it is forming part of the evidence base for the local plan, and we have a timescale in order to get it into the Cabinet meeting on the 8th of December.
Right, thank you very much. A very lucid description of it. Are there any questions from anybody? For Katie?
No hands or anything.
Oh, hang on, here we go.
That's the horror.
Hello, yes, please, far away.
Chair, thank you. You mentioned that the document had been discussed with town and parish councils in August. How many of them actually participated in that consultation, please?
Well, everyone was invited, and I think there was 17 or 18. It's been put up on a YouTube, well, our YouTube channel as well, the actual presentation event. So it was available, that got sent out to all the parishes as well afterwards for those that couldn't attend.
But how many, if I may just ask, sort of made a contribution and it gave you feedback then to this document? Because obviously it's a fundamental sort of foundation stone.
Yeah, well, they'll have that. Yeah, they'll have that opportunity through the consultation period of the, assuming we get the go ahead for the supplementary planning document. But yes, it went out in 2 or 3 times in different formats, with the link to the video and the document itself. I didn't get any comments back.
So if I may, Chair, just I think it's one of those documents that's huge in size, however very important. I think we should just request to you and the officer team that maybe we make a particular effort to ensure that parishes and town councils really do pay attention to this. It's one of those documents that will creep up on people, and in 6 months' time they'll go, I didn't know it said that.
No.
And if you've received no feedback, it worries me that people have sort of noted it but not necessarily consumed it, as it were.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, the bones of it are not very different to the 2004. It's laid out in a relatively similar way. It's just a little bit more usable, and of course we've had to alter some of the boundaries because we've taken South Downs, so 40% of the district out, which chops up some of the parishes, and and those parishes were sent separately a plan showing how they're subdivided effectively between the two. So they have had quite a lot of information, but ultimately what's written, the main bits is not different to 2004.
And Chair, may I just ask,
Yes.
for those areas where it's clear that if you're in one camp or another, in those areas where there is a combination of authorities, how does that balance if there's a difference of opinion on a particular element? So if you're in a place that has both authorities having an interest, how does that balance?
Well, that's a rather difficult one. I mean, hopefully there won't be, I mean, the science of doing a landscape character study are quite well proven, and there's guidelines for it. Mm-hmm. So the descriptions and the mapping are going to be very, very similar. It's not as if one person is going to describe it one way and the South Downs describes it another way. So I don't think there's a huge danger in that.
No, interestingly, actually, the only thing that is, and I don't really know why South Downs have done that, but they've swapped their types and areas around. So what we have as an area, they call a type, and what we have as a type, they call an area. But it's the same thing. They've just called, swapped those two things around. But apart from that, that was one of the real reasons we didn't want to, cover any of the South Downs, was that you'd end up with two documents saying the same thing but with slightly different words maybe, and that gets confused. The same with the local plan. So where you fall within South Downs, you would refer to the South Downs character assessment. Where you fall in Winchester, you do the same. You fall to ours, just same as you do with planning.
I think there's always a bit of confusion between landscape character and landscape types.
Yeah, and I think my understanding of South Downs is because they're so vast, it's such a big area. For some reason they've felt that it works better calling them the other way. But all other landscape character assessments will have areas with types in it rather than types with areas in it.
I think.
And Chair, could I just ask you? I think you or Katie said that there was going to be consultation in the new year. So is that post the Christmas and sort of new holiday period for 6 weeks?
Yes, starting so that's what I'm going to Cabinet for on the 8th of December, is to ask. We want to get this adopted as an SPD, so we need to consult for 6 weeks, and we're going to start that assuming we get the go-ahead on the 10th of January. Which will take us through till the 21st of February.
Thank you, Chair.
Right. Are there any more questions from the panel?
I can see that Adrian has just raised his hand. So I didn't know whether he wanted to come in at this point, Chair.
Well, I tell you what. Why don't we ask? Yeah. Okay, Adrian. If you'd like to ask your question, or is it?
Thank you, Chair. No, it's only just a point picking up on what Councillor Horrell said. We are going to Cabinet, Katie's going to Cabinet on the 8th of December. What we could do, I don't think it would be too much work for Katie, is to email the parish councils after that Cabinet meeting, just to give them the early heads up that we're doing a consultation and it will be starting the new year, just to help them plan their agendas and their time frame. Because rather than sending them an email on the 10th and going, here's 6 weeks, I don't think it would hurt to send them an email just to say it's coming on the 10th for a 6 weeks consultation. Just want to give you the earlier heads up. You can have a look at the Cabinet report. And I'm just wondering whether or not that would just be helpful, Chair.
I think that would be an extremely useful idea, because people tend to put things onto the back burner until they get an email saying, have you noticed this? And then they wake up and do something about it. So yes, that would be a very good idea. Now, Victoria has got her hand up, and I think we can take questions from councillors, even if they're not on the panel.
Thank you, Councillor Russell-Smith. This is not really a question, it's just requests, please. The online document, the maps are of very, very poor quality. And so when you try and expand on them, they're just useless. You can't even read them, I'm afraid. Online, they're useless. I can't even read what numbers they've come into. So I just asked if you could just improve on that to have a really good quality map to make it a really usable document, because at the moment it's not really usable.
No, it's because somebody had to squash it down so that it could be opened by members as part of your agenda pack. But no, they are good quality otherwise. So. Well,
it does become a very, very heavy file, I know. Right, okay.
We send the maps then separately to members so we can have a really good look at them.
Well, I can send a wee transfer to whoever would like it.
Yes, please.
Because, and that's what I had asked to happen, but apparently that's not normally what happens. So it got squashed, and that's when you squash them. But we can, yeah, I mean, or if you wanted to wait for the consultation, it'll be a link on there.
Right, okay. I mean, I found the summary of the dangers and the threats to the landscape very useful. I mean, that really is absolutely essential that people read that. Right. Perhaps you could remember to take your hands down afterwards, otherwise it gets rather confusing.
Hand is a new one.
It's another one. OK, Caroline, if you'd like to ask your question, Councillor Hall. Councillor Hall.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sort of in Councillor Weston's camp. If we could have the link, please, for the maps as members of the panel of the LPAG, I think that would be helpful to us because we can use the time pre-consultation to look at that and understand it more effectively. So if they're available and we can have a link or we can pick it up off of our document files, that would be really helpful to all of us, I think. Thank you, Chair.
I don't know how,
before we can sort that.
Yeah, I don't know how to get the maps out, but you can have a link to the whole document. And then you just jump to them.
I think it would have to be the whole document. I think to start taking all the maps out is I mean, it's a re-edit, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
A link would be lovely. Yes, please.
Right.
Okay, I don't know who the people are, so do I send a link to Nancy to send on?
Yes, thank you, Katie. Yes, if you send it to me and I can forward it on to whoever needs, whichever councillors need to have it, for the members of the LPAG, I assume.
Right. Okay, well, we've had the questions. Should we move on to the debate?
I'm not seeing any hands or chats, Chair.
Right.
Oh, Councillor Horrell.
Councillor Horrell.
Sorry, Chair, I seem to be hogging the show, but just keen to make sure that an important document like this that forms the basis of the local plan is well understood. So I think one of the things I think as a member of the LPAG, we could just ensure and Mr. Fox's idea of sort of giving people, councils, the heads up on this is a really good one, because we don't want them to suddenly find themselves in the first week of January with, you know, a lot of work to do, and there is a lot of work to do on the local plan if they're going to participate fully. So as much as we can give to them, the better. And just to clarify, Chair, this is almost a question, and I apologise, I should have asked it earlier. Has this been a desktop exercise, or has this been done? I know Katie said that it hadn't been, there weren't many changes in fairness, relatively, but how have we approached that? Thank you, Chair.
If you read the introduction by the people who did it, the consultancy Terra Firma, they started off with a desk study and they took the earlier version as the starting point, but they did go round and check stuff on site and take a lot of new photographs. I think that's correct, isn't it, Katie?
It is indeed, yeah. They checked it. They checked it all out, having done the desktop initially.
Well, I think the fact that they came up with a very good summary of the threats to the landscape, you know, they're able to pick up all the changes that have happened since the original one. and you know, we can understand there are a lot of threats.
Yeah, indeed.
So, Chair, you're reassured that we have got verification of, you know, we've looked and seen. It's not just that we have a sufficiently thorough assessment of that. Sorry, Katie, it's probably a question to you if you've dealt with this. We've had a thorough assessment of what the reality is rather than what we think the reality is.
We have, yeah, exactly. So they did the desktop first. They then applied the updated methodology because that changed a little bit in 2014, and they went and checked as well, you know, out and about. So it's all been done according to the methodology that you know, is published by the Landscape Institute with Natural England's support.
Thank you. Just really helpful to clarify, so we're really clear when we go forward on what basis the work has actually been completed.
Right.
Thank you for that.
Right. I think, is there anything else you'd like to add, Katie?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I think this was really just to let you know this was happening, and whether there was any other sort of comments that we needed to do or take on board. So the fact that we'll remind the parishes as it exists and the town forum, then in advance. Hope we get the go ahead on the 8th of December to go out to consultation to become an SPD. I mean, if not, I suppose it would just stay as a document. It doesn't become an SPD. It just lives as it is. But I think it'll have more weight.
Yes, well, I don't want to preempt any decision by the Cabinet, but I think it would be very useful if we could get it out. Right, okay, thank you very much for that.
Okay,
and
is that me done?
Yes, you can relax now.
Okay, right. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Right, the next item on the agenda is a summary of the responses to the strategic issues and priorities, and Adrian Fox is going to give us a run through on this.
I'm sorry to jump in, Chair. Just before Adrian starts, we've just had a message on the chat from Councillor Edwards, who's joined the meeting, and he apologised for being late.
Oh, right, okay, good, well. Right. Would you like to carry on, Adrian?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Chair, members and officers. So tonight we're talking through the analysis of 4 topics that we've gone through in terms of the strategic issues and priorities consultation. We'll be coming back to LPAG on the 13th of December with another 7 topics. So this PowerPoint presentation covers 4 topics. So let me just screen share with you. Okay, can you all see that? Could you just confirm?
Yes, thank you. Yep. Adrian.
Yeah,
thank you.
Fine, thank you.
Can we have it full screen? Oh,
there we go. So just to remind, we're obviously at this critical stage now where we're analysing comments and reporting those back to LPAG. And just to remind everybody of the kind of C numbers, the E numbers, the L numbers and H numbers, what they all mean, and the total number of response. Obviously, we had a fantastic response to our consultation, and obviously that slide there, you've seen it before, but that kind of breaks down where we got those responses from. So to kick off, so the first topic that we're reporting back on is the sustainable transport topic. And you can see at the top there was a question that we kind of raised as part of the consultation. And just to kind of run through kind of some of the key points raised. Interestingly, obviously one of the key points was we should have more ambitious policies. And obviously linked to that is we should obviously really promote obviously the step change away from the car use and obviously more sustainable forms of transport, and recognise obviously the health benefits of obviously promoting active travel and making the use of obviously public transport, but also making that greener, and obviously making sure that obviously the sustainable and active travel options are of good quality and available and prioritised over the cars. Now that's a kind of key issue in terms of obviously the type of surface and obviously the key linkages, obviously whether or not its linkage is obviously lit at night, and how safe people feel. So that's obviously a very important message. And we need to make the car kind of less convenient mode of transport to prioritise obviously more active forms of transport. And obviously make sure that we've got sufficient infrastructure to allow kind of easy and convenient electric car charging points. The next question was, well, at the top of the screen there. And the summary of the key points are, the majority of the respondents agreed to this statement or strongly agreed to the statement. We should direct development to areas, to these areas, and resist where we don't have good public transport or active transport links. We still need to allow for some form of rural development, and that's obviously important because obviously we still need to obviously plan in the rural area and make sure they're connected. And obviously we're all working from home still at the moment, so we need to consider obviously home working post-COVID, and still take into account obviously the needs of children, elderly and less mobile people as part of our obviously package of measures that we want to introduce in the new local plan. And obviously all of the above is really important to obviously help the council meet its climate emergency targets, and obviously it will help to improve air quality if obviously we are able to promote more sustainable and active transport. We asked a question about whether or not there was the need for additional park and ride facilities, and where would you like to see additional park and ride facilities in the district? The majority of people responded to that, said there should be more park and ride facilities, but the question over whether or not this would be needed in a post-COVID world, with obviously more people working from home. But there was a need and overall feeling that obviously the buses need to be more greener, in terms of obviously the way that they obviously feel rather than actually anything else. And we should promote more active travel and the park and cycle or park and walk, or obviously walk and stride. The majority of people thought the park and ride should be provided in the north and the east of Winchester, and that obviously links into discussions that we're having with obviously the DRI in terms of John Moore Barracks, but also looking to link other towns and districts such as Fareham, Eastleigh and Basingstoke. And then obviously one comment down the bottom, do we need such an anti-car bias with electric cars coming online? And obviously the credentials for kind of these might have better greener credentials than diesel buses, etc. We asked particularly about the 15-minute neighbourhood, 15-minute city, and obviously what people's thoughts was. The good news was that the majority of respondents agreed or strongly supported this statement, including Sport England. We need to be 15 minutes safe and convenient for people to travel. So it's not just about a 15 minutes distance, it's more about making sure it's safe. But obviously recognising that the 15-minute kind of neighbourhood city idea is dependent on geography, kind of weather, etc., and obviously encouraging people out of their cars. There was no support for communities to build on greenfield sites to support this aim, and there was a general kind of encouragement for how we can encourage people to shop locally, and that was obviously good for promoting the community itself. So in terms of kind of the analysis and way forward under sustainable transport, definitely the overarching feeling was that we need to be more ambitious and promote a step change away from car use. We need to make it less attractive for cars to meet our climate targets. We need to support the active and sustainable transport and make transport that we are promoting greener, and concentrate on making walking and cycling safer and more convenient. There should be key considerations in the local plan about providing more park and ride facilities to the north and east of Winchester, and looking at linking our district together with other districts via a park and ride system. Looking at obviously the potential for park and cycle. There was support for the 15-minute neighbourhoods, and obviously how we can obviously use the 15-minute neighbourhoods But obviously we need to bear in mind that obviously not everywhere is suitable for a 15-minute neighbourhood. And we do need to take into account the less mobile population when we're planning, obviously, the local plan. So the next topic we analysed was a topic that we introduced in the SIP called Living Well. And basically what we were asking people to do was, what do we feel about the current way that local plan and national policies are around open space for protecting, obviously, health and well-being and reducing inequality? Clearly, the issue of living well has come up the kind of political horizon since obviously COVID, and the importance of obviously providing open space. And that came out in the second bullet point there about obviously protecting existing open space from development, looking at obviously whether or not we should designate local green spaces. Sport England made the comment that we should perhaps look at reviewing the existing play and pitch strategy. And obviously the accessibility of open space is really important, and obviously this picks up on the less mobile population in terms of obviously wheelchairs, buggies, mobility scooter and paths, and obviously we need to plan for that as obviously we've got an ageing population. And there were some deficits identified in certain wards who obviously it was an important point about places that don't have their own amenity space. But obviously, fundamentally, this whole topic was about obviously how we can improve people's mental health and well-being, and obviously how we can promote that in the local plan. And that's obviously been a major issue as part of the COVID. So summary of the kind of key points is that we need to think about living well as part of our new developments, and obviously the places that we're allocating in the local plan, the development sites. We need to create balanced communities and look at obviously the accessibility and creating lifetime homes. That's in other words, homes that are obviously fit for future generations. We need to look at kind of community infrastructure, and that's obviously important in terms of social connection and tight supported communities. We need to think about obviously movement and transport, and the location of the new development, which obviously is in the development strategy, and how this kind of directly influences health and well-being. And obviously the concept that we were promoting in the SIP was obviously about the 15-minute settlements, using brownfield sites and inner city accommodation. In terms of open space, review the existing open space strategy, that work's underway, and look at the play and pitch strategy. Review and assess the accessibility, inclusivity of open space provision across the district, that work's underway. Look at obviously whether or not we wish to designate any areas as local green space, and the tests that obviously are in the Mppf, and make sure obviously we're not duplicating work that is ongoing as part of the open space study. The design of the developments, I'll come on to the local plan design workshops they've just completed, and obviously how we can incorporate obviously living well in obviously our new design policies. And obviously look at community infrastructure to determine whether or not it needs strengthening, and obviously what we can do in that regard. We've put up on the screen there, Tower Hamlets have a policy on living well. It's just an example of the way other local authority has tackled this issue and made sure it's fully embedded in the new local plan. So it's one of the things that obviously as part of our research, we're having a look at how obviously other local authorities have incorporated this really pressing and important issue in their local plan. So like I say, I'm not saying that this is definitely the policy that we will use, but it's a good example of how other local authorities have tackled this issue. The next topic we looked at was low carbon infrastructure. And obviously it's really important that obviously we think about low carbon infrastructure and low carbon energy as part of our kind of climate emergency lens, and how we obviously reuse existing physical infrastructure where possible to minimise carbon emissions. We are obviously trying to prioritise brownfield sites first, and obviously look where there are existing infrastructure so that we can build on that rather than building completely new infrastructure to link together greenfield sites. And obviously, the next point is looking at obviously how we could focus new development on existing transport corridors to obviously strengthen public transport networks. That's really important in terms of obviously the settlements that we're looking at as part of the development strategy. And again, there was support, there's some crossover with the previous subject, because obviously there was support for the 15-minute cities, low carbon neighbourhoods, public transport and electric vehicle infrastructure. So a summary of the key points was obviously we need to consider as part of our local plan the flooding, drainage and water consumption and sewage infrastructure. We need to think about waste management, so that's infrastructure required, so that's curbside recycling, food waste, how we plan for obviously houses to obviously plan for the storage of bins and recycling. Importantly, we need to think about digital infrastructure. That's obviously mobile phones and broadband, which has obviously become really important as a result of lockdown to facilitate home working and reduce the need to travel, and obviously importantly connect rural communities together. In terms of energy infrastructure, we need to think about how obviously we approach the generation of renewable energy, and obviously the visual and landscape effects of, for example, solar farms. And how can we decarbonise homes, heatings and utility capacity? So this subject covers quite a lot of issues that are obviously at the heart of obviously the climate change emergency. Linked to that is obviously how we build climate change resilience into the local plan, and food security and living well. So like I say, there's a lot of crossover with the previous topic. Green infrastructure, how can the local plan kind of encourage and promote obviously people to grow their own food in their gardens and obviously community areas? How can we link together green infrastructure networks and connect together areas? And obviously that comes back to obviously how we can make sure that we discourage the use of cars, because obviously the more attractive that we can make these green links, the better really. So in terms of obviously how we need to do this subject also covered the local plan viability assessment. We've just appointed Dixon Cell Partnership to undertake a local plan viability assessment. So they'll be looking at all the costs of any new policies in the local plan that have a cost element to them, and obviously working out whether or not obviously a development would still be affordable if obviously we ask for different requirements. And that's really important in terms of obviously demonstrating that local plan is deliverable as a whole. We also need to produce, like we did in the previous local plan, an infrastructure delivery plan. So that understands obviously the type of infrastructure we need, the costs of it, where it's going to happen, and that all needs to feed into the local plan viability assessment that's just been commissioned. And the final topic we looked at was that how do we monitor the delivery and success of the local plan? Key messages were that any targets that we have to monitor that need to be clear and regularly reviewed. It's got to be accessible and in the public domain and on loan so it can be easily viewed. Many people suggested what indicators we could use when we're monitoring a target, in other words, to see how successful the plan is working or whether or not it needs to be reviewed. And the impact of new housing needs to be monitored, was a clear message coming through. And obviously we need to consider the impact of development is having on obviously the net zero carbon and obviously the carbon emergency declaration. The kind of other points were, at the moment, there's too many objectives in the consultation document and we need to review those. We need to simplify them and we need to improve the current monitoring system that we have in place. And we should be more ambitious and based around collaborative working. And joined up working was thought to be of a benefit and a key issue to involve local level stakeholders and parish councils in that. And how can the reporting be at more of a local level, and the ones that are responsible for the objectives should be the ones reporting on it. So in terms of obviously kind of the way forward, we need to conduct an audit of our current monitoring framework. So at the moment, obviously, we monitor the local plan through the authority monitoring report that is issued in December of every year. So we need to review what's monitored at present and how it can be presented in a clearer way through graphics and infographics. And that's something I've been talking to the team about recently. If there's any gaps in, for example, particularly housing data and things like that, we need to think about, are the targets ambitious enough? Is there any data that we're not collecting and we should be collecting, and to make it more accessible? We need to simplify the number of objectives and have them making sure that they're measured in a meaningful way. We need to look at how other local authorities are monitoring and presenting their data, because obviously we're keen to learn from others where obviously they've got a successful monitoring framework in place. And more importantly, how can we monitor, align our local plan monitoring framework with the carbon action neutrality plan to report on carbon neutrality? Number of trees planted, biodiversity net gain, number of EV charging points, and obviously mobile phone and fibre broadband. So it's all kind of bringing it back to the climate emergency. And we are keen to work with the parish councils to continually improve the local plan monitoring framework to make it more local and more meaningful. So that's a rather quick kind of overview of those 4 topics. I do have on the call my colleagues Jill Lee, Steve Obercheck and Bethany Stokes, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I apologise, that's rather a lot to digest, but like I say, happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I can see there's an awful lot of work gone into marshalling all the responses into, well, an understandable framework. Yeah, there is a lot of it, but it's pretty clear. Very good. Thank you very much. Right. Now, shall we open it up to questions from the panel, first of all? Councillor Horrell. Yes.
Chair, thank you. I don't know how you want to take this. I've got actually quite a lot of questions. Do you want me to just do them in chunks, say do sustainable transport bit by bit? How would you like me to put these, or just give Adrian the long list?
I think if we start at the top and work down,
Okay.
and hopefully other people, your questions will provide answers for other people as well. They won't ask the same question over again.
Thank you. So on sustainable transport, Adrian, the issue around question 2 is about the need still for some rural development, because otherwise we're not going to have sustainable communities in our rural parts of the district, which are the main part of the district. So how do we get that balance? How do we still have the balance of the rural development that is required, even if they don't have public transport links? And you know, that is perhaps a future wish and is not going to be solved in the immediate term from a planning point of view. Because it would be terrible to tell your community you can't have that because you don't have the transport infrastructure.
Thank you, Councillor Horrell. I think it all comes back to our previous LPAG meeting where we were looking at the development strategy that we were going to go forward to, obviously the new local plan. And if you recall, we were looking at the 8 settlements that we have in the existing adopted plan, because we thought that was a sustainable transport, sustainable strategy. And obviously we've included 3 additional settlements plus Winchester. Clearly there might be opportunities to look at obviously how, for example, some of the developments in the north, particularly I'm thinking around South Monston, could, if you brought together a series of development sites, how that could possibly enhance, say, for example, a bus route, existing bus route, and things like that. So I think that's what we're keen to do, in terms of obviously looking at how we can expand and obviously promote the use of buses. But obviously it does come back to creating obviously opportunities to connect places together. I was at a meeting this morning with Alresford New Alresford Town Council, and we talked about this issue with them, and it's all about making places better connected so that we encourage people not to use the car where they can get to facilities and services. So like I say, can't say that's for every kind of community, but certainly in the larger market towns, there obviously are services and facilities, and what we've got to do is obviously enhance the connections and the accessibility and make sure that we obviously promote obviously those active travel over and above obviously the use of the private car.
Adrian, forgive me, but I didn't think we'd agreed which development strategy we were taking yet.
We discussed at the last LPAG. Do you remember we had slides on obviously the development strategy that we discussed in terms of the feedback, and like I say, that was the purpose of obviously the last LPAG, to report on obviously our development strategy, and we had a debate on that at the last LPAG meeting.
I accept that, but we're just an advisory group. I didn't think the decision had been made by the council in this process as to that is the definitive development strategy we're taking. Because you're talking about, for example, South Wonston development, but that was in an original version of the SIP that never actually was circulated for public consultation. So I'm just intrigued to hear you state so definitively that that is the direction that we're going in.
Could we ask Simon Finch, who's got his hand up, to answer this? I think that might be slightly more in his line.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And good evening, members, to you. Yeah, I mean, I think Councillor Horrell, that's the direction of travel. I mean, you're right. The only way you actually set a strategy for the new local plan is when we develop the Regulation 18 local plan, which in English, really plain English, is the draft local plan. What we did, as Adrian's explained there, to sound out, get advice, get feedback, which is obviously what you are here to do and you provide for us, was to just look at the feedback we got on the development options that we consulted on as part of the strategic issues and priorities. And that's the basis upon which we can look forward to developing that draft local plan. And that was the sort of the strategy that it's almost like a strategy plus almost that seemed to be quite popular with the feedback that we received on the SIP consultation and also from the advice we received from the panel. So, but you're quite correct in terms of setting that and getting agreement for it and what it actually looks like, because it's one thing having a strategy, isn't it? And then you've got to put meat onto the bones about how that translates into development. And that's what we'll do when we go through the process of drafting the local plan, the draft version of it, and then going on to formal consultation. The other thing I was just going to mention, actually, Adrian's covered most of it, but to answer your question, yes, it's not a case of saying we don't want to see any development in rural areas. That isn't a case at all. And of what people tend to focus on when they think of development, naturally, is housing. And that will be clearly covered within the development strategy of the local plan, along with employment, floor space, etc. But equally, we have policies in the local plan that we need to review. And I can remember Councillor Humby raising this when he was district head many moons ago, about making sure we've also got policies which are permissive policies, which support existing rural business and businesses that require or need a rural location. And so it isn't solely, but we tend to focus on, what everybody tends to focus on is where we put all the housing and all that sort of thing, but it's much more than that. And so we can look at having permissive policies that tell us effectively and tell developers what's appropriate in the countryside and what we wouldn't be able to support. And hopefully that gives you a bit of clarity. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Simon. Right, Councillor Horrell, you said you had a list of questions.
Yes, so on sustainable transport still, Chair, the point made about whether we do or do not need more park and ride facilities based on whether people are actually returning to the car in any shape or form post the pandemic, or emergence from, should I say, from the pandemic. Are we collecting data as we go over the last few months and the future months to help us inform what is happening in terms of all of those studies that were done previously as part of the movement strategy to define where we needed park and ride and the extent of the places that we required?
Could you provide an answer on that, Adrian?
Chair, I'm quite happy to pick up Councillor's point if that's okay. Only because I obviously remember very clearly the movement strategy. And what we're doing at the moment, Councillor Horrell, is liaising with Andy Hickman, who you probably know is the strategic lead, and he works with the county council on developing that movement strategy and translating that into action. And you're starting to see that now on the ground with things like Voltex, etc. You know, the multi-storey car park. And what we've been talking to Andy Hickman about is just those sorts of points, because what we need to do is to ensure that when we translate this into local plan policy, it's soundly based, because we will be asked that question by the inspector, if nobody else, in terms of, you know, do you need that policy in your local plan and what's the evidence for it? So what we'll be doing, and are already doing, and in the context of things like St John Moores Barracks that Adrian mentioned earlier, you know, we will be looking at that as that movement strategy and the associated work that goes with that to move it into the implementation phase, and that can help us and guide us with policy in the local plan. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Simon. Right.
Chair, again on sustainable transport, question 4, encouraging people to shop locally. One of the questions I have is that sometimes they're a matter for licensing and other regulatory bodies within the city council as to whether some of these elements could become available within the 15-minute community idea. What are we identifying as other policies that will need to be amended or reviewed to even allow some of that to happen?
Well, I'm not sure that, I mean, licensing applies to the sale of alcohol, but other shops and so on, by change of use, would allow quite a lot of different things to happen.
Well, Chair, it's not clear, I don't think, in here how you're going to enable, you know, how is a community going to get the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the outdoor restaurant, you know, the wine shop or whatever, all within 15 minutes, unless we talk amongst our other bodies within the city council about where facilities are placed and what we allow them to do or not.
Oh,
it's
I see.
Not just about planning, it's about other decisions within the council's policy structures.
Adrian would like to help.
Right, Adrian, if you could clarify those points, perhaps.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because obviously the local plan can only do so much in terms of obviously promoting obviously 15-minute city. Clearly it doesn't work for every settlement, but obviously again we can have permissive policies in terms of obviously supporting obviously the obviously local facilities and things like that. But clearly obviously licensing and things like that, it's outside the remit of obviously the local plan itself. But what we can do is obviously, if we are planning a kind of a larger development, think about obviously how we can create a mixed use kind of settlement and mixed use community. Thinking particularly about Sir John Moore Barracks, if we were to allocate that. But obviously the main thing is it's part of it is a behavioural change as well that we're trying to encourage people to do, to think about shopping locally. And I know from my personal experience as a result of COVID, my shopping habits in terms of food shopping has changed dramatically. And obviously I am shopping more locally now than I was pre-COVID. So part of it is a behavioural change, but obviously, like I say, part of it is obviously how we can be supportive in the local plan of obviously local community facilities and services, so that people don't have to drive to large supermarkets. They can shop locally. Thank you.
Right.
Would you like me just to add to that, just to pick up
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
Simon.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a good question, and as Adrian is quite right, it's a spatial plan. We used to call it land use planning, and then the Royal Town Planning Institute quite right said it's beyond just uses, it's spatial planning, but it's often underpinned by what we can do in terms of facilitating use and development, and equally protecting it where it's needed. And we can do that, and that's something we will need to review, Councillor Horrell, in terms of things like shopping facilities, local arcades, etc., which is what you're talking about there in terms of people not having to drive long distances to access services. As Adrian said, it's not going to be possible in every single settlement, and that's not to say that, you know, we wouldn't allow any development in those areas. I mean, licensing regime that often run alongside, and as the chair said there, I mean, they control certain things. Whether it's, you know, events or sale of alcohol, whatever it, licensable activity basically, and they have criteria that they need to consider when they're looking at those types of licensable activities. But I wouldn't envisage necessarily there being you know, particular conflict there necessarily. They have got to consider those things, and they consider things which are, as you know, different to what planning has to consider. The considerations are different, but from experience of doing this for longer than I care to remember, I'm pleased to say that in most cases where there is a license required for whatever use it is, whether it's music or whether it's alcohol sales or whatever, generally speaking, they don't tend to undermine what we're trying to achieve through the local plan. So whilst they look at different things, and some need permission and some don't, they often run really sort of complementary to what we're trying to achieve in the local plan. But as Adrian said, first and foremost, the thing that the plan has to deal with, it really has to focus on is that use and spatial planning, and we can look at facilitating that and equally protecting uses that we want to protect. Hopefully that's helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Right, perhaps now we could ask Lucille Thompson for her question. That's all right.
Thank you very much, Councillor Gordon-Smith. Yes, it was just a comment and a question really. And the first comment I'd like to make is that it's really interesting, I think, the feedback that we've got from the consultation, which really does clearly show, I think, that our residents are taking on board the climate emergency and really want us to see us progressing with measures to combat it in as many ways as we can. A question I asked earlier, which was obviously it's around sustainable development, and how do we ensure in the local plan going forward that we have policies that will be flexible enough to as standards in terms of zero carbon development progress. How do we ensure that for certainly on the larger developments, that once they've got planning, there is some mechanism whereby as standards improve, as I've said, we can ensure that the rest of the development is perhaps built out in an even more sustainable way than when it was first started, I suppose. That's my question. Thank you.
Right. Adrian.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Thompson. A really good question. I can't say I've got the answer tonight in terms of obviously how we shape that policy. We've obviously got to make sure that we'll be coming to you in December LPAG meeting to report back on the carbon neutrality topic, and obviously that issue came up in those kind of things. The main thing is trying to make sure that we create the framework to allow that to happen. The government is very clear that they want obviously the local plan to do some things, but also obviously the building regs is the way that they see things changing. But I think it's a very important point, because obviously the local plan's looking towards 2039. The world's clearly going to be a lot different to what it is now. Even in 5 years' time, it's going to be totally different. So it's making sure that our policies are ambitious enough, but they're also grounded on obviously key things that we can measure, but also obviously they are viable. So we've got to get that balance there. Like I say, that's something that we will be clearly having a very good look at with our colleagues such as WINAC to try and get that balance right and to push it as far as we can and to make it as clear as possible. and our expectation about what information we want developers to come forward with to demonstrate that they've really thought of that. So they're thinking about obviously the climate emergency, the climate lens as part of the design process, as part of their kind of first port of call is how can I make this site sustainable and resilient to obviously climate change? What is the best way we can look at that? That's obviously starts with kind of analysis of the site, the orientation of the building, the type of buildings, the way the buildings are constructed. So there's some key kind of principles that we need to put at the forefront of people's mindset when obviously they're looking at potential sites to come forward. But like I say, that's something that we will be working with obviously our colleagues at WINAC to kind of develop and look at best practice, see how other councils have approached that issue, because it is a challenging issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right. Now I think Councillor Horrell, you.
Oh, Councillor Brooke had her hand up again as well. I don't know whether it's
right.
up
Okay.
to you how you want to.
Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. I had a particular question with regard to the open space and uses of open space. So it was raised in a couple of places in the document about the inequalities and deficiency of the open spaces in St Luke's Ward and Stanmore in particular, and Badger Farm. So, and it was also suggested about the health benefits of the natural green space and adopting Natural England's standards. I was just curious as to, according to our figures on our previous policies, how far astray are we on the inequality of access to open space? I mean, is it a huge problem, or is it just, well, actually, if we put in a little bit more, it's okay? And how far are we away currently from Natural England's figures? Thank you.
Adrian, could you answer that?
Thank you, Councillor Brooke. Yeah, very good question there. I'm not as close to the open space work that the landscape team are currently updating the open space standards and the open space work at the moment. That work is ongoing at the moment, but clearly it is an important issue in terms of obviously existing development and new development in terms of our open space standards, and looking at opportunities as they arise to obviously see, well, is there a potential for perhaps more green infrastructure, or obviously an area of open space? And in some wards that is particularly challenging because obviously the nature of them. But like I say, the landscape team are currently looking at kind of open space standards and the open space network, and that links back to the green infrastructure as well. But like I say, in some wards I do appreciate it's very challenging, but that's not to say that we shouldn't look at it. It's just obviously how we can look at that in a positive way through the local plan. Like I say, that work's ongoing at the moment.
Thank you, Adrian. Right, Councillor Horrell.
Thank you, Chair. We make a comment in the Sustainable Transport paper, Adrian, about the needs of less mobile in the population. And I think there is concern from some of the consultation responses about those who are literally less able and not as mobile. What in particular are we doing to ensure we understand what those needs are and the specifics of the number of people who feel that they might be disenfranchised somehow if we don't actually take some of that into account?
Well, with new buildings, there's disabled access built in with the building regulations. I mean, it's a much more it's much easier to access and to move around urban areas. Some way to go. Perhaps you could expand on that, Adrian?
Yeah.
And Chair, this was in the sustainable transport section. It wasn't. It was about.
Yes.
It was about, you know, people reaching those local communities. But if you have some mobility issues, how are we taking account of that? What is the scale of that? What is our position as an authority in terms of supporting those who are less able to access some of this?
Perhaps I could answer, Chair. from our side, from the local plan side, I haven't got any facts or figures or anything like that. But it does come down to obviously how we are connecting together settlements in a positive way. And obviously, again, we can have permissive policies that obviously support that. And obviously the connections to enable people to get to services and facilities. But like I say, I don't have any facts or figures or things like that. It came up as part of the consultation. They're generally speaking quite a hard to reach group to obviously understand their needs. It's not something that kind of I'm aware is readily available data in terms of obviously finding that. But I think obviously it's how we plan and obviously the approach that we take in the local plan to make sure that we think about those less mobile, less accessible ways, and think of that in a positive way about what we can do, for example, with the design policies, what we can do in terms of obviously any transport policies, to think obviously about that. So have it at the forefront of our mind. But like I say, I haven't got any kind of exact facts or figures, but obviously we want to make sure this plan is inclusive of everybody. So it's obviously a key issue that we need to bear in mind and weave into the local plan itself.
Right, are there any more questions?
Yes, Chair, I have several.
Please ask them.
Thank you. Chair, in Living Well, Adrian, a couple of specifics. We've got sort of the environmental bill and potential impacts, and also just to nail specifically in the responses in the consultation, people mentioned the green belt, but I don't really understand at this point, based on your presentation today, what our position on that is. So in the context of those two more formal processes, could you just help us to understand, please, where we are on the way forward? Thank you.
Would that be a good one for Simon Finch to answer?
I can answer the environment bill if someone wants to do the green belt.
Yeah, if we do it that way, then Chair, if that's okay with you, then I'll let Adrian and Adrian can do that, and I'll come in about the green belt. Thank you.
Okay.
It's always nice when things work out like that. So yeah, if I deal with the environment bills, so yeah, the environment bills come into force. We need to think carefully about how we embed obviously what's required under the environment bill into the local plan, and obviously one of the key things is biodiversity net gain. One of the key things is obviously it's very clear in the environment bill what you need to do under biodiversity net gain in terms of obviously the benefit, but obviously what we need to do is bottom out, what does the local plan need to do? Does the local plan need to have a specific policy on biodiversity net gain? If so, what does it need to include? And we have been having discussions with our neighbours in Hampshire about that very issue in terms of obviously trying to understand, because obviously this has only just come in. So we're working with Natural England to try and work out how do we need to approach this in the local plan, because we're also very clear that we shouldn't just repeat what's in the Environment Bill or the Mppf. It's got to have some local kind of significance. So it's just trying to understand that at the moment. But it is something we're working on very closely with Becky from Natural England. And we want to meet in with her very soon in the new year to try and understand that what we should do in the local plan to make sure it's fully embedded in there without just repeating what's in the Environment Bill or the Mppf. I suspect the Mppf will probably change as a result of the Environment Bill. So like I say, at the moment, it's on our radar and it's one of the key issues that we've got to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, very clear. Thank you.
Simon, if you could.
Yeah, sure.
Answer the questions
yes.
on the green.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Yes, we asked the question because it was something that's been raised with us, and also, as you know, probably Councillor Horrocks was raised in the context of Partnership for South Hampshire as well. That's why we wanted to seek people's views on the green belt. What that means is the only way to allocate a green belt effectively to designate is through our own local plan, and the same would apply to any other authorities that wanted to do the same. Generally speaking, they often would run across a number of different administrative areas because they tend to be by their very nature strategic, as you know, and that's why effectively they've been raised in the context of Push, and why Push has now commissioned that work, which I'm pleased to say Adrian is part of, in terms of the commission that's been given. He was on the panel as well, so we've had input directly into that and into the brief. To simply say as well, what we also need to bear in mind, we need to see how that plays out. But equally, the government guidance is actually quite clear on the designations of green belts. So it's absolutely right to ask the question in the SIP, because we wanted to know what people thought, and we got that back. But what we would also have to have regard to, as will the wider work and Push, of course, is you've got to start by looking at what the Mppf says about designation of green belts, because if we were to put that in the local plan and other councils were to do the same as and when their plans came forwards, what the government inspector in the inquiry will ask is, well, why is that necessary when existing tools that you've got at your disposal are not sufficient? And what's changed effectively, and what the Mppf does quite well actually, is it runs through how you would approach that, and clearly the implication of what the government guidance actually says is they're not expecting lots and lots of new green belts to be designated. Similarly, they're not expecting lots of existing green belts to be removed or changed necessarily. So that's what we would have to follow. So we look at what the SIP says, but it's a broader issue, I think, because of that strategic implication I mentioned earlier. But Adrian, I don't know if you want to say just a little bit more, so I'm sort of handing the baton back now, but only because you've been directly involved in that wider work that Pushes commission. But hopefully, Councillor Horrell, that's given you a bit of insight what we need to think about when we move that to that draft local plan Reg 18, and we would certainly be doing that given the feedback that we received from the SIP consultation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Caroline, have you got any more questions? Some other people have got their hands up.
Yes, Chair, I do actually, a couple, and one has just been troubling me based on the conversation we had earlier, which is the sort of dispersed development strategy, which was in the first SIP that wasn't circulated because it was put to one side because of the government's review of planning, did have the allocation of housing numbers in particular to certain parts of our district. That wasn't clear in the consultation document that went out earlier this year. So if we are orientating ourselves for the Reg 18 to that strategy, when are we going to share with those communities who are on the list from that first document to have that allocation, so that they're aware of that? Because that may have changed people's views of their responses if they'd known where and the quantity of homes that were intended.
Right. Adrian, I think Simon might be better equipped to answer that particular one.
Thank you.
Well, probably, thank you, Chair. Probably a joint effort. I mean, Adrian has said a bit more about the housing, the way we would deal with that in the Reg 18 plan, and we did in the SIP consultation. We did set out development strategies, I think, and ask for feedback on those. I mean, for example, you could go down the route, but it wasn't very popular from memory in terms of having major development areas, for example, to help meet that housing requirement. And as you know, the housing requirement is a bit of a movable feast because it's reviewed periodically because of the way that the government wants us to calculate what that need is. So you only ever get a snapshot in time. I think basically what we will be looking to do, though, and this is something that we're basically starting to talk about now to answer your question, really, is we'll be asking the parish councils, particularly those settlements we talked about earlier that are going to be looking to provide some additional housing, whether it's the market towns, larger villages or Winchester. We'll need to think about looking at that in the context of we're in a good position compared to some of our neighbours in the sense that The housing numbers in terms of being able to accommodate with their own district is certainly achievable, and in actual fact, as you'll see when the Sheila goes through cabinet next month, we've got many more sites than we'll ever need to allocate in this plan and probably the next one. What that means is that's a good thing, in the sense that whilst some people find that a bit disquieting because they think that means a site is listed, it's going to be developed. What it does give us actually, and what we will be discussing with the parishes, is looking at identifying exactly where the best sites are, and if we've got options, that's much better. Some of our colleagues, which you would expect that are more, far more densely developed, Portsmouth, Southampton, etc., that really are going to struggle or find it much more difficult to accommodate the need that they need to plan for. What we need to do is to identify the best sites of those that have been put forward as potentially developable. Vast majority we won't require, and that dialogue is something we need to work out quite quickly in terms of having those discussions with the parish councils. Adrian, is there anything else that you just wanted to add to Councillor Horrell's question?
Thank you, Simon. It was only the point that every time I meet with the parish councils, I'm very clear to say this is obviously the sites. Obviously, helpfully at the last LPAG, we gave everybody the heads up in terms of obviously which Sheila sites are in the mix at the moment. It is only a register of sites, as Simon said. Obviously, I'm keen for the parish councils to take ownership of this because we're all in this together. So I have had some very good communication with some parish councils who've looked at the Sheila sites already and told us their views. And that's what we want, is obviously the parish councils to proactively look at the Sheila sites. They've obviously got a lot of local knowledge. We've obviously done a very initial high level kind of assessment of those sites. And as Simon said, we then want to obviously come together to have that discussion in a positive way to say, OK, we need to meet this housing requirement. How can we do it? Which are the best sites that we can go for? And those discussions, like I say, would happen in the new year. We've got to work up the exact kind of arrangements for that, but they would happen in the new year. Like I say, and obviously it depends on obviously what numbers of houses are obviously being permitted already and how things have obviously gone. But like I say, the main thing is to ask parish councils, can you join us with this journey? Be proactive. Look at the Sheila sites. You've got as much information as we have in terms of those sites. Please have a look at those and bring your local knowledge and expertise to the table. And some parish councils have been really good at feeding back comments to me. Thank you.
Right.
Chair, could I just ask on process of the team? The Sheila sites are due to go to Cabinet for approval. We obviously had a look-see last time at the LPAG as to what was on the list. Are we going to get sight of what is the final definitive list before it goes to Cabinet?
The presentation that we did to the last LPAG meeting is the one that's the report that's going to the 8th of December is the performers for that behind those sites. If you recall, there was discussion at that meeting. Well, we want to see the performers, and they weren't completed. We've now completed those, so it's no different in terms of what you saw on the LPAG meeting a month and a half ago, whenever it was. So you had the early heads up. These are the sites that are in the 2021 Sheila. There's been a couple withdrawn, but no sites have been added. So you've already seen what we know. What you'll get is a detailed performer.
And the graphics are clearer, and they're all on the separate sheets, each one. So it's more understandable. Last time there were complaints that the maps couldn't be read, and now they're, well, as clear as day. Now, Councillor Pearson has had his hand up for some time.
Well, if we're doing panel members first, is Councillor Brooke, who's also.
I beg your pardon. Yes, okay. Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. Just my question is, obviously within this consultation, something that's particularly not mentioned is nitrates, which, as we know, is going to be a big stumbling block. So just wondered, when we do the workshops following on from this, and hopefully everybody is as engaged as they should be, and we're going to be looking at strategic issues and priorities. I'm just curious as to how, in amongst all of this and all these challenges, nitrates are going to be accounted for moving forwards, the unnitrate issue?
Well, Simon, I think this is rather your particular.
Yes. I'm very glad that Councillor Brooke has asked that question, because it's taken over my life for about the last year and plus. Basically, it will be addressed through the local. It has to be, because it's all part of habitats rates assessment, etc. And it has been a major issue, as Caroline Brooke has alluded to there. What we have been working hard to do is to put strategic solutions in place for our developers so they can access the mitigation they require to enable them to build and occupy their developments, which is absolutely critical that we do that. And we've made some substantial progress, I'm pleased to say, across all fronts. Winchester is a bit more complicated than some of our colleagues in neighbouring authorities, because we have 3 catchments, not 1, to deal with. And generally speaking, the mitigation you need to provide needs to be in the same catchment area as the development. What we are very close to doing is in fact, one of the ones that's caused the biggest issue is the test ditching catchment, which is Winchester and land to the north and south of that. And I'm pleased to say we've just reached an agreement with a provider at Romsey that can sell nitrate credits to developers within that catchment, and that catchment stretches across Test Valley, Southampton, Winchester, etc. Eastleigh Borough Council has also decided to delve into the nitrates market by acquiring land for nitrate credit purposes, and we're about to do the same in terms of reaching an agreement with them, and that will open up the market further. We have other options for the other catchments as well, and I think basically what's happened is there's been a lag between people that are able to provide nitrates or see an opportunity to provide nitrate credits for developers, but they've now seizing those opportunities, and more sites are likely to come forward to increase the supply. What we've also done, a chap called Simon Kennedy, who is an officer that works directly for Push, has spent an awful lot of time, probably far more time than even I've done on this, in terms of looking at need, supply, etc. And it doesn't look too bad now coming forward, at least in the shorter term of the next few years. And the other thing to say is that some developers that are bigger in scale can effectively consume their own smoke. The people that have the biggest difficulty are the small and medium developments, because frankly, it's probably not feasible for them to mitigate. What they can do with support from or schemes which are recognised by councils and Natural England is they can now acquire credits which they can put towards effectively mitigating the impact on their developments. We will address that through the local plan. We can look at that, and actual fact as well, Adrian, I think we actually did ask in effectively calling for sites, not just through the Sheila, but as a parallel process we did at the same time for other uses, including mitigation and biodiversity, etc. And we did have a response to that. It wasn't as overwhelming, surprise, as people that think their housing sites might be suitable for development, but we did get a response. And we can elaborate on that if that's helpful, but just to provide some reassurance, it is moving forward, and I'm now cautiously optimistic that we will see movement on that front very shortly. Thank you, Chair.
Right, thank you very much, Simon. Very lucid. Right.
May I speak now, Chairman?
Yes, of course. Do please, Councillor Pearson.
Thank you. I'm very aware that I'm not on the group, but I'd like to make a number of points which may turn into a series of questions. The first one, I'm a little startled, Adrian, that you haven't heard that the Environment Bill actually is the Environment Act now. Very different status from a bill. And it's a peculiar bill, and it's a combination of regulations and enabling for future regulations. You don't seem to be taking that into account. One point. Second point, local gaps are important as far as biodiversity is concerned and settlement identity. While you do refer to these gaps in the landscape characteristic study, I notice, it's nothing much in what you've said about the link between local gaps, even the green belt, and biodiversity needs that we're all in favour of. The next one, a need for people to grow their own food, which you've got in a number of points. That implies space for gardens and or allotments. I assume that some of the open spaces, the Sheila sites will be open spaces, i.e. allotments, but that doesn't do much for gardens, which are also important for biodiversity as well. And the final one, I'm very nervous when people start talking about nitrate credits. That seems to land up as using meadowland, which is very, very good, but it doesn't do anything for the improvement of the sewerage infrastructure. And it basically means the foul water disposal companies seem, therefore, because they've got nitrate credits, they seem then to still find that they can not improve the sewage plants, i.e. pour water into the test. We've had lots of examples. Hamble, I'm particularly nervous about in my particular area, and of course the Main Valley as well. I would like somebody to make a comment about that. It's nitrate credits and carbon offsetting. Well, I think you all know my opinion of that. Frankly, the word immoral has been used in the past, or one of the meanings of immoral, and there's a temptation, if you're talking about nitrate credits, the polluters is just carry on doing what they're doing, and that really is no solution for what we need. If anyone would like to make comments on that, Lord, it's a long list, but I'll be grateful to hear a response.
Right, okay, let's see if we can get that answered reasonably quickly. I think, Simon, can you?
Yes, I'm happy. Shall we take if we get Councillor Pearson's last question first, and then hopefully Adrian won't forget what Councillor Pearson said of the first questions, which are, yes, I mean, I think to be honest, Councillor Pearson, when this problem emerged, there was a lot of scratching of heads thinking, well, you know, most of the issue actually comes from agriculture. That's the first thing to say. It's not development, but development contributes through residential development because of the sewage that it generates. And scratching heads in the sense that a lot of that is, as I think you've alluded to there, is actually treated before it's discharged, before it gets into the water environment of the Solent. But the fact is we've got to deal with where we are now. And what we're trying to do is to find or help find solutions that enable development to proceed rather than being stymied and effectively frozen. But I take that point, and that's points that have been made, and there just isn't a timescale to review the permits, etc. Because, as you know, most of these are controlled. You know, these are permitted waste treatment works. I'm sitting here about a mile from one at Peel Common, and they're all permitted. But that doesn't seem to remove sufficient nitrates not to exacerbate the problem in the water environment. So that is absolutely something which is part of the issue, but we can't resolve that. But what we do have is developers who are extremely keen to get on and build their development. So what we're doing is finding solutions, and that generally takes the form currently of nitrate credits. DEFRA is doing the same. They put millions of pounds into a trading platform for the same sort of thing, and it may go beyond. It could be beyond nitrate credits, and that's to be launched next year as well. So they're clearly on board with this and trying to help developers find a solution to the issue in the shorter term. In the longer term, if it means that permit controls change, and what is then discharged into the environment, you know, is not going to cause that problem, which is being experienced in those sensitive environments within the Solent, then that's a possibility. But for now, we are where we are. We had the problem identified. All the councils in Push and beyond have been wrestling with it with varying degrees of success, I would say. But I understand it precisely why you asked the question, because I think that was one of the questions we asked ourselves when the issue was first identified. But as I say, what we've got to get on and do, we have a responsibility to maintain our good supply of housing, which we've managed to do, unlike some councils in Hampshire, and it's part of that solution. But I agree with you, in the longer term there ought to be a permit review, and I think that's what will happen. But we are where we are, so we need to put some solutions in place for developers now. Hopefully that's giving you a little bit of clarity on that one, and I'll hand back to Adrian for your other questions, if I may. Thank you, Chair.
Before Adrian, I think Steve Opacek has got his hand up. I think he's trying to indicate he might have some pertinent information to give us.
Yeah, just very briefly, following on directly from what Simon said, that as he said, the discharges are controlled by permits that operate or that apply to each sewage treatment works, and many of the works in our district don't have or the permits on many of them don't actually set a limit on nitrates. But just to confirm that the Environment Agency have agreed that they will start a review of those permits. I mean, that's going to be quite a long-term process, but at least they're going to start to review that to look at whether nitrate limits ought to be imposed on works that don't have them at the moment, or whether they ought to be made more stringent on works that do. So, you know, it's as Simon said, actually housing or development that waste that passes through treatment works are actually only a relatively small part of the problem. That most of it is coming from agriculture, but at least things are starting to move on that. Thank you.
Right, Adrian, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, if I can do, Chair. First of all, apologies, Councillor Pearson. Obviously, it's been a long day. The Environment Bill was in place for ages and ages, and it's obviously only gone to an act, so apologies for my terminology, but it has been a very long day, so yes, it should be obviously the Environment Act. In terms of obviously don't seem to be taking it on board, we are taking it on board. I think the trouble is we're in a very new area in terms of obviously how the local plan can address it. This is obviously a new requirement. That's why we're talking to our Hampshire colleagues and obviously Natural England about how we need to address it in the local plan. But it does come back to the fact that we don't want to just repeat what's in the Environment Act. It is a case of obviously looking and talking to obviously the specialists, in this case Natural England, about what we need to do. And there's been quite a few webinars and discussions on that. So like I say, these are brand new areas. So apologies if we're not up to speed and can't give you any answers at the moment, but we are on the case, be rest assured. And obviously we need to think about how we address that in the local plan. In terms of obviously local gaps, sorry, Chair.
No, sorry, yes, carry on, gaps.
In terms of local gaps, yes, we do accept obviously and acknowledge how important they are locally. And obviously what function they have, and obviously how they can be strengthened, or obviously whether or not they need to be reviewed. But no decision's been made on that yet. But obviously that is work that obviously we need to look at. In terms of obviously growing your own food, we did have a lot of positive responses about that. That comes into obviously how we plan settlements, how we plan our design policies, but obviously that does involve a behavioural change, because not everybody wants to grow their own food. We can facilitate that and have permissive policies that encourage that, but obviously I can't convince my neighbour to grow their own food if they don't want to grow their own food. But the main thing is, I think as a result of COVID, I know from my own personal experience, I'm growing more vegetables now than I ever have, but that's a personal choice. So I think it's again having permissive policies that obviously encourage that, and encourage that as part of the design kind of thinking and ethos that we have, if we want to obviously, and we want to be serious about the climate emergency, how we can embed those kind of ideas. Actually, that's a good thing because it stops people driving to the supermarket. But again, that's a behavioural change that we can only go so far in the local plan. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Perhaps now we might conclude the questions and move on to the debate stage, if anybody has a point to make.
Councillor Horrell.
Councillor Horrell.
Chair, thank you. My take from this evening, and I hope I've understood the responses correctly, is that as an LPAG, we don't have any decision-making power or authority. We're there to advise and hopefully input to the discussions. It's clear to me that there's a working theory on which of the development strategies we should be progressing based on what Adrian and Simon have responded to us on this evening. And although that's fine, I understand that's their prerogative, we haven't had a formal member agreement that is where we are heading. And I'm not sure it is completely clear to the communities impacted that what that outcome might be. So, Chair, I say openly in this meeting, it would be helpful, I believe, if we were more explicit about our working position, because it is clear from the responses there is one, so that all of the interested bodies can actually participate, because they may help or they may hinder, but nonetheless, I think it is better to be properly informed as to what our working theory is at this point. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Useful point. Right. Councillor Pearson, do you have a comment to make on the debate?
I think it was an old hand.
An old
Chair.
hand.
Sorry, it's an old hand.
Oh, right. Okay. Right. Any other contributions?
None that I can see.
Right,
there.
we'll
Thank
take
you.
that as that issue as having been dealt with. And the next item is a presentation and an introduction by Steve. Well, Steve Opacek will introduce it, and Adrian Fox will share a presentation on the partnership for South Hampshire and an update.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good evening, members and Chair. So the presentation starts with a brief background to Partnership for South Hampshire, which has been around for a long time now. I can remember it from sometime in the 1990s, when it started as a Partnership for Urban South Hampshire, with the more urban authorities wanting to work together to improve economic development in their area. And as it spread out to some of us more rural authorities, the urban was dropped, but the acronym PUSH has remained. So it's a long-term partnership between the authorities in South Hampshire, and it was actually turned into a formal joint committee in 2007, at which time PUSH was advising on the South East Plan and what sub-regional strategy ought to be going into the South East Plan for South Hampshire. The South East Plan was scrapped, and the authorities then worked on what was called a spatial position statement, which they agreed in 2016, or a joint strategy it was more commonly referred to. And that was based on a housing market assessment, which looked at the housing needs in the PUSH area and other evidence, and came up with a recommended strategy. That was never put into any of Winchester's local plans, because we already had a local plan by that time, and the one we're working on now is going to be the next one. So after that spatial position statement, we had the changes to the Mppf, and the standard methodology was brought in for assessing housing need. So the authorities agreed that they needed to update their joint strategy, and they worked on what was called an initial statement of common ground, and that went to the PUSH Joint Committee in September 2020. And it was basically an agreement to work together on strategic planning matters, and it set out a series of areas of work and evidence studies that the authorities would work on, with a timescale and which authorities were involved and so on. So that is a formal agreement that our deputy leader signed at that stage. So moving on to the next slide, please, Adrian. The work streams that are being progressed through that statement of common ground, there are four key ones that I've highlighted here. The first one is a study of potential strategic development opportunity areas, as they're called. The statement of common ground looks at what the housing requirements are for each of the authorities in PUSH, and what the current housing supply is, and there is a shortfall, and I'll come on to what that is later on. But this study is basically aimed at looking at strategic scale areas that could potentially be developed to meet that shortfall. And by strategic scale, they're talking about areas that could accommodate 500 or more houses. So that study is underway. work is just being completed on the transport modelling and assessments of that, and officers are being kept up to date on that, and I'll come on to the timescale for it shortly. The next area was an economic, employment and commercial needs study, which has been finished, and that's on the Push website, so I won't say anything more about that at this stage. There's then the Green Infrastructure and Green Belt designation study. So that's doing two things, looking at what green infrastructure would be needed in association with the development that might come through the strategic development opportunity areas. And also critically in relation to one of the questions just been raised, whether a South Hampshire Green Belt is justified. And you'll note that that is a whether rather than how, or it definitely should be, because as Simon Finch mentioned, there are tests in the Mppf for what a new green belt would have to do, and they are quite stringent tests. So we need to and the consultants that are being commissioned to do that will look at, is there a case for that, and what are the alternatives, and what's changed that might justify a green belt. I put there being commissioned. Actually, the consultants have been appointed, but I'm not sure it's been publicised who they are. So I can say that those consultants, I believe, are now in place, and they are a large, well-respected firm of consultants that have got a lot of experience in this area. So that study is being started. And then finally, a strategic flood risk assessment for the Push area. There is an existing flood risk assessment that's getting out of date now, so this is updating that, and it will look at what the impacts of climate change might be in the long term. It's looking 100 years ahead in terms of sea level changes, surf, groundwater, the changes to rivers and so on. So those are the key areas of study. And moving on to the next slide, Adrian, please. There was an update on progress on the Statement of Common Ground to the Push Joint Committee on 25th of October. So that was after our last local plan advisory group. And at that group, we had a bit of discussion around Push, but I wasn't able to say too much because the details weren't public. But really, this report is a brief summary of what was in that report to the Joint Committee. So anyone who wants to know the sort of a bit more detail, that's a good place to look. It's on the Push website. But there are updates on those work streams, and with target dates for when they'll be finished. So the Strategic Development Opportunity Area study is due to be presented in Q3 of next year. So that's or summer to autumn of next year. And they're working to the same programme on a recommendation about the Green Belt. So that both those studies are working towards a conclusion towards the middle of next year. Now, as officers and as members involved in Push, we will start to know which way those studies are going relatively soon. So although that may sound very tight in terms of working it into our new local plan or draft local plan, which is itself due for publication in September next year, we will know what's coming out of those, and we should be able to take that into account in drafting the local plan. So that report also had an update on the housing needs and housing supply, and that used the latest standard method figures because these change every year. The information that feeds into the calculation under the standard method changes every year. And also this year, the government out of the blue decided that the 20 largest cities in England would get a 35% uplift in their standard methodology, and those 20 cities include Southampton, although not Portsmouth. So there's been a change in what the housing requirement was in the last year, and obviously also in the supply. And the result of that is that the shortfall that had been identified when this was considered in September 2020 has now increased to about 13,000 dwellings, largely as a result of that Southampton increase, but also changes in supply. But it is worth pointing out that this is a snapshot, and the supply is really existing planning permissions and existing local plan allocations. And there are some authorities that won't have an up-to-date local plan like us, so they will be identifying more supply to meet their own needs, and that will affect the figure. On the other hand, the shortfall or the requirement may change through the standard method or other things that the government does. So that's always changing, and that's probably going to need to be updated on an annual basis as well. So just moving to the last slide, please, Adrian. So really, to conclude, there are these streams of work that are ongoing, and the intention is that they will enable Push to produce an updated joint strategy, and that would replace the 2016 strategy. And that will also aim to address the shortfall in housing. And obviously there are authorities within Push, particularly the more urban areas, that may not be able to meet all of their own needs, and under the duty to cooperate, they'll be looking to some of the authorities, perhaps more rural like Winchester or Test Valley, to help out with that, and the study will produce a strategy for how that could be done. But Push isn't a statutory body, and any strategy they produce won't be part of the development plan. So the mechanism for actually allocating any sites will be through local plans, and we will have control of that. And obviously, as I've said, the timescales just about enable us to include any necessary allocations or greenbelt or non-greenbelt in our local plan. As I say, it is likely that Winchester will be asked to help meet the shortfall under the duty to cooperate, but it's not as simple as saying, oh, the urban areas are all full up, so big districts like Winchester with loads of countryside can take all the difference. We might, on the face of it, have loads of countryside, but as you'll know, much of it is pretty remote. It's not well served by public transport, and it's not easy to cycle or walk into the main urban areas. So the studies are going to look at that, and obviously with climate change, that's going to be increasingly important to come up with a transport strategy or development strategy in which transport and sustainable transport is a key part of it. So that tends to suggest that it may not be as sort of harmful for Winchester as people might on the face of it think, but obviously we don't know the outcome yet. And what that will lead to is a strategy, and then the various authorities under the duty to cooperate will say, well, we've looked at what our needs are and how we can meet them. We've got a shortfall. Under the Push strategy, Winchester, Test Valley, whoever it is, you ought to be helping to see whether you can provide some of that. And the duty to cooperate is very important. It's not something we could just say, no, we don't agree. What we have to do is cooperate effectively. And when it comes to an examination of our local plan, the duty to cooperate is the first thing the inspector examines. And if he finds that we haven't cooperated effectively and cooperatively, he won't take the examination any further, and we won't have a sound plan. And in fact, the government advice is, if that's the position you're in, it's most likely that you're going to have to withdraw your plan and start again. So this is a very serious thing. It's not like other tests of soundness where an inspector could say, well, I'm not happy with what you've done with that policy, but if you modify it in a certain way, you'll be sound. It's something that by the time you get to submitting your plan, if you haven't got it right, there's no opportunity to put it right. So it's a very important issue, and obviously the fact that we're all working together is a key part of showing that we are doing that cooperation, and that cooperation is needed whether we're part of Push or not. So really that's all I've got to say. No doubt there might be some questions, and I'm happy to try and answer those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Very useful, very good summary. Right. A question from Caroline Brooke.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So understanding, of course, the duty to cooperate doesn't mean duty to do, and also acknowledging that recently some local plans have been rejected just on this point, as you say, it's the first thing they look at. Reading between the lines, it sounds as if we are in need of some large sites within the push area, some large sites. And am I correct in reading between the lines that perhaps they need sites of perhaps 500 plus houses, which might be in Winchester, might not be, but that no one's really being told about yet, because that's how it felt as I was listening. And I wondered what engagement we've had in that conversation, if any.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so it is large sites that are being looked at, as I say, of 500 dwellings or more. Obviously, across the push area at the moment, the current shortfall is about 13,000 dwellings. So, you know, we're looking at large numbers that need to be provided, and hence the consultants have been asked to look at large sites. The sites that have been put forward, certainly the Winchester ones, are all sites that were identified in our Sheila. It's actually not the current one, it's a previous one, because this work started a year or so ago. So they're all sites which are in the public domain, not necessarily being identified as a possible strategic development opportunity area, but they're all sites or groups of adjacent sites that have been put forward and that are published in our Sheila. The consultants were also asked to look at whether there are any other areas that they identify through their studies that might be suitable for large-scale development that don't happen to be promoted by a landowner, and they're doing that. So that sort of picks up anything else that might be suitable. I don't recall that there are any of those in Winchester, so I think all the Winchester sites are sites that are taken from our Sheila. It will be much the same for all the other districts as well, either Sheila sites or emerging local plan sites. And I'm certainly not saying that the sites are only in Winchester, you know, or even only in the more rural districts. There are sites in the urban areas as well. So there's a variety of sites. And what the consultants are working on is looking at different alternative strategies that could be developed by grouping sites that score well in different ways. For example, to develop different transport strategies and so on. I can't say too much about it at the moment because A, it's work that's ongoing, and B, it's not in the public domain yet. But yes, there is a lot of work going on, and officers are being kept fully up to date with that. And there will be a series of meetings starting next year between officers and involving the key members and leaders, looking at what those options are and trying to agree what is the preferred one to develop as the joint strategy.
So thank you, Steve. Chair, through you, if I may, just to follow up on that. So I'm noting that you can't give us any more detail because it's not in public domain, but presumably those sites are already identified. They have target sites in order for them to investigate them. And if they were to say it needs to be at this site in Winchester, I mean, it feels as though it would be really difficult for us to be able to push back and resist that under the duty to cooperate, even though it's a really large scale site. I just wondered what thought we've given to that and how, you know, how we might accommodate that and not just have it done to us, but actually cooperate rather than be done to.
Well, that's what will happen through the officer and member meetings that will be held to develop a joint strategy. So Winchester will be part of that conversation about what is the best strategy. Obviously, we can't just sit there saying none of the sites ought to be in our patch and they all ought to be in someone else's. You know, we've got to do that in a realistic way, but we'll be part of that process. After that, once Push agree or all the push authorities agree what their preferred strategy is, yes, there will be a lot of pressure on us to translate that into our local plan. There would potentially be the opportunity to say, well, okay, we hear what you say, Push, but we think a better way of meeting that number in Winchester would be to put them here rather than there, or whatever. You know, there is an element of choice in that, but realistically, I don't think we could realistically say, well, yeah, we hear what you say, Push, but we don't think we can accommodate any of this. You know, we've got to be reasonably positive about it. Otherwise, you know, inspector's going to say, as he has with some other local authorities, well, sorry, you just haven't cooperated effectively with your neighbours.
Right, thank you. Might I ask you a question, Steve? Mm-hmm. You said it's very critical that we've show to the inspector that we have fulfilled the duty of cooperation. I mean, how exactly do you do that?
Well, the formal method is to have statements of common ground with each of your neighbours. So every neighbouring authority, you have a statement of common ground, and you either agree that you can meet your own needs within your own area, or if your neighbour has demonstrated they can't, they would ask us to take some of it. And that's why what Push are doing is to develop a Push-wide statement of common ground, so the inspector can see it's not just sort of individual authorities, if you like, arguing amongst themselves or cooperating amongst themselves. There is some strategy behind this as well. So, a thing like a statement of common ground that has been agreed by all the Push authorities is going to be accorded a lot of weight by an inspector, and the inspector would very much welcome seeing that, because that very much demonstrates that we have cooperated. We have neighbours who aren't in Push, but generally speaking, they can meet their own needs and they're not likely to be asking us to help them out. So it is the Push authorities that we need to be seen to be working with.
Thank you very much. It's very clear. Right, are there any other questions? Councillor Horrell. Councillor Horrell?
Chair, thank you. Maybe I could ask Steve directly. So Push is a body that we've consulted widely on for our local plan in Winchester. Over 2,000, I think, responses, and Adrian was extolling the virtues of that earlier. And yet we cannot participate in the Push discussion. We just have a member of the cabinet representing us. So where is the democratic process for the residents of Winchester to comment on this? I don't see where it happens. And in the new statement of common ground that I understand was published and approved in October at the meeting you refer to, we've got something like 5,800 houses identified for Winchester. On the last count, I think we needed about half of those. So I'm already concerned that we're doubling our commitment on the provision of housing supply through to 2036 in that document, and the implications for us here in Winchester. So we're having all these really helpful discussions and consultations on the documents that have gone out, and in parallel with this is a body that is determining what potentially could happen to us in Winchester, because we're still perceived to having ground and space for homes, and we're not party to that at all. I mean, can you help me to understand how that is right and democratic? I don't understand it. And duty to cooperate is one thing. Duty to deliver another 2,500 homes is another thing altogether. Thank you, Steve.
Well, the democracy in it is through our involvement as one of the authorities in Push. Now, I quite agree. Push doesn't tend to be very good at public consultation, and as an authority, or as representatives of Winchester, we've always pushed, excuse the pun, for Push to be doing better on public consultation. But the authorities make the point, well, our strategy isn't going to be a statutory document. It's all very well us consulting on it and then agreeing a strategy, but ultimately it's up to you districts to put it into your local plan, and that's where the real democratic process comes in. So the push work, these studies will be evidence that will lie behind what we are being asked to put in the local plan, and if we agree with that evidence, then we will no doubt have to put something in the local plan. So it's our democratic process and our consultations that will have to pick this up. I agree, it is frustrating that push isn't more open, but they do make the point, well, they're not the statutory planning bodies, that is the districts. And what push is doing is trying to demonstrate that we are working together in developing our local plans.
Thank you,
Right,
Steve.
thank
Chair,
you,
can
Steve.
I just ask, in one
Yes.
of the pages that Steve presented, there's a Q3 2022 delivery on some of the studies, but obviously we'll be in Reg 18 by then. So how do we tie up some of the information coming through in terms of our own process if it's supposed to be built in to the local plan?
Yeah. So what the detailed programme behind this is for those studies to be presented in, I think it's June, July next year. Our Reg 18 plan is due to be published in September next year. So it is very tight if you just look at those dates. But as I said, as members and officers, Winchester will be involved from the beginning of next year, really, in those discussions about what the strategies ought to be. So we will know how that's developing and be able to take that into account in drafting the local plan.
And Steve, could I ask, are the officers' meeting minutes published so that we can see what the discussions are, so that those of us who are clearly interested in the local plan can actually understand what the direction of travel is, or are they not in the public domain?
No, the meetings aren't held in public and the minutes aren't published. Well, there aren't necessarily minutes and notes of meetings. So it's really the joint committee that is the public face of push.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, any other questions from the panel? Right, is there any debate?
Councillor Horrell, Chair.
Councillor Horrell.
I'm afraid there is, Chair. I think it's an absolute outrage that the latest statement and duty to cooperate has such implications for the Winchester local plan, and most people are flying blind in the district. They don't realise what's been going on, and I've been saying about push for months and months, as you and your predecessor will recall. I agree with Steve, and thank you, Steve, for being so open. It is not good at consulting as a body. I appreciate it isn't the one that is going to drive the decision. It will be our local plan, but nonetheless, that information is all being fed into our local plan, and I suggest that anyone interested listening to this call looks at the report of the Partnership for South Hampshire's Joint Committee and their statement to cooperate, and understand what Winchester is being signed up for and participating in. It is only part of our district, we accept, because not all of the Winchester district is in the push area, but nonetheless I think we all need to be aware of what is being said on our behalf and signed up to by our deputy leader of the council without any consultation with the LPAG group or indeed the broader groups who are interested in the local plan. And that's no comment on the officers, Steve. You're dealing with the parameters in which you're working. I accept that entirely. It's not a comment on the work that you and other officers are doing. It's just about the process and how it stands and the implications for us as a district. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Horrell. Right. Well, if there's no more debate, then we can move on to setting the next date, or the date of the next LPAG. Adrian, if you could talk about that, and also on the review of any of the remaining topics.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, the date that we've identified is 13th of December at 6 o'clock. As I said at the beginning, that will go through the remaining analysis of the SIP topics. So there's another 7. So apologies, there's quite a lot to read and digest, but we'll do it in a similar way with the PowerPoint, trying to pull out obviously the salient points, and obviously happy to take any discussions. We may, with that one, because there's so many topics, might perhaps do one topic and pause for questions, subject to your agreement, Chair, because there'll be a lot to digest in those ones. But like I say, it's been a lot of work to get us to this stage, but hopefully, as Councillor Thompson said, there's been some really helpful comments come back, and the key thing is now, how do we use them to shape and inform our new local plan? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Right, I think we might draw the meeting to a close. I would like to...
Councillor Horrell has just raised her hand.
Right, Councillor Horrell.
Sorry, Chair, I've taken to heart this evening's meeting and a lot of important points, I think, for all of us. Chair, can I just clarify, because obviously we've received the consultation feedback in various chunks, because I know that we've had a lot of detail and we've broken it down into different sessions. When we get to the end of all that consultation feedback, are we as a group going to be shown, you know, what are the top 10 elements from all of those various sections that we have reviewed, the most important, so that we can get a sense of priority? And I know that's but the officers have the, you know, the really detailed knowledge of all of the comments, and I appreciate you've collated all of those and given a real attention to detail. But it would be helpful to all of us, you know, if we had the one most important thing that everyone mentioned, what would it be? And, you know, what is that top 10? That would be really helpful, because we've received this in several different sessions over a period of time, just to understand what the, you know, what the key issues are that our residents are raising with us across all aspects of the local plan. Just a thought, Chair, that might help us all focus on the most important. Thank you.
Right, okay, well, I think the answer, I will reply to that by saying I'll discuss that with the officers and see if we can simplify it. I mean, they spent a lot of time distilling down from a vast amount of contradictory information and contradictory ideas, but I dare say we can manage to distill it a bit further to a purer spirit, perhaps.
Thank you.
Right, in that case, I think we might draw this meeting to a conclusion. I'd like to thank the officers for the immense amount of work they've done and for their ability to think quickly on their feet and answer questions that are coming thick and fast. And I'd like to thank the panel for the time they've spent, and for the other members who've attended and helped us progress this forward. Thank you very much, and good night.